And good evening. Welcome to today's seminar on the sources of current Sino-Indian tensions. You all are aware of the ongoing standoff between India and China along the line of actual control. To talk on this issue, we have eminent scholar, Professor Sumit Ganguly. I was fortunate to attend his classes on research methodology at IDSA maybe around 2010. Professor Ganguly need no introduction, but to follow the tradition, let me reintroduce Professor Ganguly to the introduced audience. Professor Sumit Ganguly is a distinguished professor of political science and holds the Rabindranath Tagore Chair in Indian Culture and Civilization at Indiana University, Bloomington. Professor Ganguly has previously taught at James Madison College at Michigan State University, Hunter College, and the Graduate Center for the City University of New York and the University of Texas at Austin. He has been a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center of Scholars in Washington, D.C., a visiting fellow at the Center of International Security and Cooperation, and at the Center of Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford University. A guest scholar at the Center of Cooperative Monitoring at Albuquerque, and a visiting scholar at the German Institute of International and Area Studies in Hamburg. He has also held the Asia Chair at Sciences Po in Paris and the Ngee Chair in International Politics at Rajaratnam School of International Studies at Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. He is a distinguished visiting fellow at Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis in New Delhi and a Buffett professor at Northwestern University. Similarly, he was a visiting professor at Strategic Studies Institute at the US Army War College and was Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Heidelberg. He was a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a member of Council on Foreign Relations, and a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Science. He is the associate editor of International Security and serves on the editorial board of Asian Security, Current History, the Journal of Democracy, Foreign Policy Analysis, the India Review, the Non-Proliferation Review, Pacific Affairs, and Security Studies. He has authored, co-authored, edited, and co-edited more than 20 books. Most recent are Oxford Short Introduction to Indian Foreign Policy, published by Oxford University Press in 2015, Deadly Impasses, India-Pakistan Relations at the Dawn of New Century by Cambridge University Press in 2016 with William Thompson, Ascending India and its State Capacity, published by Yale University Press in 2017, and co-edited a book on the Oxford Handbook of India's National Security by Oxford University Press in 2018. So we'll have around 30 minutes to make your presentation, maybe 30 to 35 or 40. It will be followed by question and answers. I would like to request all our participants to type the questions in the chat box or on Facebook Live. Please also tweet about this event or at contact NIICE. Thank you, sir. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal. This is a very kind invitation and an extraordinarily generous introduction. I am going to talk about recent developments in Sino-Indian relations, and my talk is divided into 4 sections. First, I will talk a little bit about the unresolved border dispute. Second, I will talk about how India in recent years has sought to find ways to build relationships with external allies, external forces, to be able to balance the People's Republic of China. Third, I will talk about its internal efforts to cope with Chinese assertiveness along the border. And finally, I will talk about how China views India as the principal impediment to the realization of its ambitions in Asia to become the dominant power in Asia, and how India is the only strategic bulwark that could possibly thwart those ambitions, or at least from the eyes of Beijing, it is seen that way. So those are the 4 central themes of my talk. At the very outset, I'll talk about the border dispute. All of you know, obviously, the 1962 border war which was a disastrous defeat for India at the hands of the People's Liberation Army. And in the wake of that, India finally decided to devote significant resources to combating what it perceived to be a major threat from the People's Republic of China. As a consequence of this war, India lost close to what it considered to be about 90,000 square miles of territory in the Northeast, and also a substantial portion in the Northwest, in Ladakh, in the Aksai Chin region. And these areas still remain contested even today. In the wake of the war, India decided to build a 1 million-man army, create a 45-squadron air force. That still has not been realized. Only about 31 squadrons exist at the present time. But that was at least the stated goal, to create a 45-squadron air force, a 1 million-man army, 10 new mountain divisions equipped for high altitude warfare. Today, there are almost a dozen mountain divisions. So India has come a long ways in terms of military preparedness along the border. It took several years before any kind of negotiation really ensued in terms of the Sino-Indian border dispute. And it started with the famous Mao smile that involved Brajesh Mishra, who was the chargé in Beijing, the chargé d'affaires in Beijing, because India no longer had an ambassador. And this was in 1970, shortly after the Sino-Soviet border dispute along the Ussuri River. The Chinese were feeling fairly isolated and faced a distinct threat on its northern borders, and consequently, there was an incentive on the part of the Chinese to try and improve relations with India. And at the May Day receiving line, Mao personally pulled aside Brajesh Mishra and said that we are two great powers in Asia and we should live in peace and harmony. And that's what led to the original discussions. But of course, those discussions quickly fell apart because of the 1971 war. It was not really until a coalition government was in office in the late 1970s that the talks were resumed with Vajpayee, with Atal Bihari Vajpayee, the external affairs minister, going to Beijing. But unfortunately, those initial talks collapsed because right during his visit, the Chinese insulted the Indian Minister for External Affairs by not only invading Vietnam, but also saying that it was teaching Vietnam a lesson as it had taught another country a lesson earlier, a clear reference to 1962. So it was not really until 1981 that some initial tentative talks began with the People's Republic of China. And then, of course, those talks were given a significant boost by Rajiv Gandhi's visit to China in 1988. Subsequent to that, there have been 22 rounds of high-level talks involving special representatives from both China and from India. Those talks have not been particularly fruitful because both the Eastern sector and the Western sector remain unresolved. And it's only in the middle sector where there is no dispute, the two sides have exchanged maps. So the first point to bear in mind is that even after 22 rounds of extremely high-level talks, and a series of confidence building measures reached in 1993, 1996, and 2005, you still have a very poorly demarcated border in the two disputed sectors, in the eastern sector and in the western sector. And since about the last decade, the Chinese have renewed their claims on Arunachal Pradesh, which they now refer to as southern Tibet. And those assertions have become much more pronounced in the last decade. So this is the first point I would make, that the dispute, the central dispute, remains unresolved despite repeated attempts to reach some kind of a negotiated solution. So it's not as if diplomacy has been lacking in this area. There have been ample diplomatic efforts, and I haven't even mentioned the various summits at Wuhan and Mahabalipuram and elsewhere. Those summits have also attempted to deal with this unresolved dispute and have made sort of glacial progress. In recent years, particularly in the last decade, I would argue, especially under the Modi administration, less so under the Manmohan Singh UPA regimes, UPA governments, India has started to reach out to external partners. I use the word allies in my initial remarks. That's incorrect. India does not believe in alliances, but it does believe in strategic partnerships. Its aversion to alliances stems from the legacy of non-alignment, and that elements of that legacy continue to exist in India's foreign policy establishment. So the term alliances is still really unacceptable in Indian political discourse. On the other hand, India is interested in strategic partnerships with Vietnam in Southeast Asia, with Australia, with Japan, and above all with the United States. These efforts were much more limited under the Manmohan Singh governments because elements within the Congress party still believe that it is possible to reach a negotiated settlement with the PRC, and needlessly provoking the PRC would actually be counterproductive and dangerous for India. And consequently, there was a degree of tentativeness in reaching out to these partners. Modi has demonstrated a greater willingness to reach out to these partners. Under Modi, there has been a steady drift towards the United States. And of course, the United States has reciprocated, because after multiple attempts to engage China in the belief that by bringing China into the Committee of Nations, by involving China in a series of international institutions and organizations, Chinese behavior could be moderated. This was the view particularly under the Obama administration, which had considerable faith in the significance of multilateral institutions, and it sought to integrate China into various multilateral institutions until it became absolutely disillusioned with these efforts, because these efforts simply did not moderate Chinese behavior. China continued to behave in an assertive, if not aggressive fashion in the South China Sea, which ultimately contributed to the so-called rebalance to Asia, previously referred to as the pivot to Asia, with the United States choosing to deploy much greater military resources to the Asian theater, largely in an attempt to balance and to counter Chinese assertion in the South China Sea. But the Obama administration also came under some criticism for not taking a more forthright position on the South China Sea. But that's another story which we can get into during the question and answer period. The more important issue is, with the pivot to Asia, India was seen as Leon Panetta, the Secretary of Defense, described India as the linchpin of this strategy. That made some people in New Delhi a little bit nervous because of their fears of the reactions of the PRC to India getting much closer to the United States. Despite that, under the Modi administration, there has been a willingness to increasingly engage the United States, and this has been evident in the growth of military exercises with the United States, in terms of the growth of military purchases from the United States, the signing of important accords with the United States to facilitate both the acquisition of weaponry and intelligence sharing, not to mention interoperability with American forces. All of this, in many ways, has irritated the PRC, because the PRC recognizes, as I will talk about in a moment, that left to itself, India cannot pose a significant threat to the PRC. On the other hand, if it moves closer to the United States and forges a meaningful strategic alliance with the United States, and if the US is prepared to protect India in the event of a conflict with the PRC, then India's capabilities become significantly bolstered, and India then becomes a much more significant player, not just in South Asia, but also in Asia, because it would have the backing, both in principle, the military backing, and certainly the diplomatic support of the United States. And this, by the way, has been evident. Just last week, Secretary of State Pompeo, in an unequivocal statement, backed India on the recent developments in Ladakh and condemned Chinese assertiveness along the border. Earlier, the outgoing Principal Assistant Secretary of State for South and Central Asia, Alice Wells, in a prominent speech that she gave at the Atlantic Council, basically declared China to be the aggressor in Ladakh. This reflects a significant shift in American policy. Even during Doklam, the United States in 2017 had been somewhat hesitant to openly and unequivocally support India. The Trump administration has taken in recent days has taken a markedly different stance. And I would argue this reflects not just a shift on the part of the Trump administration, but also the greater growth of Indo-US strategic ties, which I have been advocating for some time, both in print and verbally, arguing that India desperately needs external support if it is going to stand up to the PRC and not cave in to its demands. Which leads me now to my third point. My third point is that in addition to seeking external support from the United States, from building a partnership with Japan, which of course has its own fears and anxieties and concerns about the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, which still harbors memories of the 1979 invasion, and there's no love lost between Vietnam and the PRC, particularly because of the PRC's extremely aggressive behavior along the coast of Vietnam, which has even drawn India in, because the ONGC, the Oil and Natural Gas Commission, was helping Vietnam develop certain gas fields well within its 200-mile exclusive economic zone, and the Chinese have issued warnings, have sent in warships into that area, and have made threatening remarks. Australia, after courting China for a long time, largely because of reasons of investment and trade, is now beginning to fear and wonder about the degree of Chinese penetration into Australia from universities to politics. And consequently, Australia is increasingly keen on forging a closer relationship, as has been evident in recent weeks, with India. And of course, as I've talked about, the United States. So all of this has placed India, I would argue, in a somewhat better situation vis-a-vis the People's Republic of China, but a great deal more needs to be done to build a set of balancing coalitions against the PRC's assertiveness and aggressiveness, I would argue, in certain parts of Asia, and especially along the Himalayan frontier. But beyond these efforts, India has also started to devote very fitfully greater resources to building capacity along the border, increased road building that has taken place. And by the way, the development of infrastructure on India is rather belated. The PRC literally stole a march on India in this regard. It built infrastructure much earlier, much more aggressively, and India basically stood by and watched. But this is the nature of Indian decision-making. There's a certain slackness to Indian decision-making, as is well known, and India has behaved in a rather reactive fashion, and so now is slowly playing catch-up in terms of constructing adequate and sufficient infrastructure along the border to enable it to move up heavy vehicles and artillery and the like into border areas to cope with the increased Chinese presence on the other side of the line of control. It has also started to build Air Force bases in the Northeast. It has moved some squadrons of the Sukhoi 30s into the Northeast. All of this is designed to have greater military capabilities along the border. But bear in mind that much of this effort has been slow in coming. It should have been done much faster. And as a consequence, the Chinese are in a much more advantageous position, militarily advantageous position along the border. Bear in mind, however, this is a far cry from 1962, where soldiers fought without thermostatic clothing, with canvas shoes, with bolt-action 303 rifles, and having fired one, I know how awful they are. India did not have automatic weapons. I'm old enough to recall living through 1962, even as a child, reading about the horrific accounts in the local newspaper, The Statesman in Calcutta. And so I have vivid memories of 1962. That is not likely to recur today, though I would say there's still a significant gap in capabilities, perhaps best demonstrated by the fact that China's military budget, at least based upon open sources, is 3 times the size of India. So there's a significant military asymmetry, both in overall terms and particularly along the border, especially because of early Chinese movements along the border, which India failed to counter in a rapid fashion. Nevertheless, I would argue that India has bolstered its capabilities along the border. It is not an utterly toothless force along the border. And this in turn gives the Chinese a degree of pause. And one of the arguments I would also make is that the repeated incursions that have taken place, especially since 2014, are efforts on the part of the Chinese to test Indian preparedness along the border, to see how the Indians might react if a small incursion is made. And these are in the nature of what political scientists call limited probes. These are probes that are reversible. These are not irreversible actions where you place yourself in jeopardy by stretching your lines of communication and logistics. You make small incursions in a number of strategic areas to see how well the Indians react, how swiftly they react, and how they deploy their forces to counter these reactions. These are essentially attempts to clarify India's capabilities and resolve along the border. Okay, let me turn now to the fourth and final point. And perhaps this is the most important theme of the four that I have talked about. Today, China sees India as the only real impediment, the only real barrier to the realization of its ambitions to dominate Asia. Already, it has reduced the American presence in Asia by asserting itself in the South China Sea, by building up reefs and small islands in the South China Sea, by building airstrips. And the United States, unfortunately, because of other preoccupations and an unwillingness also to confront the PRC directly, allowed this to happen to some degree. And so now there is what might be called a fait accompli. It's an accomplished fact that they have already established certain beachheads in the South China Sea and are potentially undermining the freedom of navigation, something that India should also be concerned with, because India now is a much more powerful trading state and has an interest in the freedom of navigation in the Indo-Pacific and specifically in the South China Sea. Given that the Chinese have already stolen a march in the South China Sea, are increasingly intimidating countries from Malaysia to Thailand to Vietnam, the only country in Asia that has at least limited capabilities to stand up to the PRC is India. And consequently, India is increasingly becoming the target of Chinese hostility. And in this context, there are two or three issues that the Chinese recognize where India might have a card or two to play. One, of course, is the Tibetan card, which India has not chosen to play with any degree of vigor so far. It has made only minor gestures, allowing the Dalai Lama to visit the Tawang Monastery, allowing Kenneth Juster, the American ambassador, to visit the Tawang Monastery, giving the Dalai Lama an opportunity to hold conclaves within India, all of which has significantly irritated the PRC. But India still has not played the Tibetan card with any degree of vigor. It has made only small, limited gestures. India has also slowly and surreptitiously started to improve relations with Taiwan, but it still does not recognize Taiwan. Now, that would be a really bold step. India could also, it has talked about selling the BrahMos missile to Vietnam, but hasn't acted on it. There's a degree of timidity to Indian foreign and security policy when it comes to China, partly in recognition of China's much more superior capabilities. But it's not as if India has no cards that it can play. And the Chinese, who are quite astute, are aware that India could play these cards. And since I am talking to a significant Nepalese audience, let me be quite categorical about this. India has demonstrated a singular lack of insensitivity towards Nepalese concerns. The 2015 blockade, I was there shortly thereafter in Kathmandu, it was disastrous in terms of Indian foreign policy, and I think has left an extremely bitter taste in amongst the Nepalese, who quite understandably have gravitated towards the PRC. This was a fundamental strategic error on the part of India, and a much more conciliatory policy towards Nepal would be actually in India's interests, rather than alienating Nepal and driving it into the arms of the PRC. So the final point that to sum up is that India is seen by Beijing as the last major barrier to the realization of its ambitions of becoming the dominant power in Asia and even beyond. Is increasingly challenging the United States and its allies in Asia, and given that it still has this border dispute with India and sees India as a rival, India remains the last impediment to the realization of its ambitions. And as a consequence, keeping India on its toes through these repeated border incursions and pressures along the border is a way of ensuring that India is kept off balance and needs to devote greater resources, which becomes a problem for India, especially as economic growth flags, to its military capabilities, and creates worries in New Delhi about the possibilities of a conflict with China. And given China's much greater capabilities, there is understandable anxiety in New Delhi about how to deal with these repeated incursions, which clearly serves the purposes of the PRC. Let me stop on that note, and I will be happy to take questions, comments, criticisms. Thank you very much, Dr. Jaiswal, once again for this marvelous opportunity.
Thank you, sir. We have lots of questions. Let me first go with first 3 questions, and then we'll go for a second round. First is, what role does nuclear weapon play in this kind of border tension? So the role of nuclear weapon in this kind of tension is the first question. Second, China signed a deal with Pakistan as part of BRI and has signed for a project in disputed territory as per India, which is Kashmir. India has not taken this in good light. What is your view on this? Third question is, why has China refused to move on sorting out the border issues, even to the extent that it is unwilling to share its perception on the line of actual control? Let me take one more question, which is fourth. With the long-standing border dispute between India and China for the Doklam standoff to Chinese troops marching into the line of actual control, is it better that India shift from a strategy of strength at the border to emphasizing capacities at sea in order to strengthen their bilateral ties with China? Sir.
Yeah. Excellent questions. First, nuclear weapons. Chinese assertiveness has grown since India tested its nuclear weapons. So clearly, the Chinese, while they are unwilling to talk to India about any kind of confidence building or arms control in the realm of nuclear weapons, nevertheless takes India's growing nuclear capabilities seriously. So nuclear weapons do play a role in terms of the Sino-Indian conflict and the Sino-Indian rivalry, because India is now increasingly developing capabilities to be able to target Chinese cities and population centers in the Chinese heartland, especially as the Agni series continues to develop and grow. And consequently, nuclear weapons do play a role, even if China refuses to recognize formally the legitimacy of India's nuclear weapons program. Second, there's no question about it that China is building a road through disputed territory in what the Pakistanis refer to as Azad Kashmir or Free Kashmir, and India considers to be part and parcel of its own territorial legacy. And this, India has protested vigorously, but obviously has no capabilities to be able to overturn the Chinese decision. But this is not the first time that China has done this. Pakistan ceded territory to China in Kashmir in 1963, which enabled China to build the Karakoram Highway, which links Tibet with Xinjiang. So this is not something new, except that this is yet another time that China has chosen to build a road through obviously disputed territory. Unfortunately, the power asymmetry between India and China makes it difficult for India to do anything beyond diplomatic démarches and diplomatic protests, which it has done. On the border dispute, why there has been no resolution? No, there's been no resolution because there's an old English expression about possession being 9/10 of the law. The Chinese possess most of the territory that they want. They control a substantial portion of Aksai Chin, which they seized in 1962. They are in no particular hurry to resolve the border dispute, and consequently, for all these negotiations, the products of these negotiations have been extremely limited. There have been these confidence building measures to reduce the possibilities of accidental conflict along the border, which have not worked very well. In fact, a former student and I are just beginning to write an article on that subject about the limits of those confidence building measures of 1993, 1996, and 2005. The Chinese are in no particular rush because they are in the advantageous position along the border vis-a-vis India. And consequently, they are happy to string out these border negotiations indefinitely. Yes, while there has been Indian restraint on land and mostly reactive actions on land, what India can do is to become more assertive on sea and start patrolling more widely, develop its capabilities in the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. It has already created the Tri-Service Command. I would suggest that it build up those capabilities, that it enhance cooperation with the United States Navy, with the Pacific Command in the Indo-Pacific. Already the US signaled its willingness to do so by changing the name of the Pacific Command to the Indo-Pacific Command, clearly recognizing that the Pacific and Indian Oceans are seamless in terms of strategy, to bolster its ties with Vietnam, with Australia, to increase military cooperation, particularly in the naval realm. All of these things should be done. And my young friend Nitin Pai, who runs the Takashila Institution, recently wrote a fairly thoughtful piece on this subject, saying, instead of trying to compete with China along the Himalayan border, what India should do is to move towards the ocean and start and adopt a more assertive position in the Indian Ocean to compete with the PRC.
Shall we move to the second set of questions?
Yeah.
The first question for the second round is in Indian internet, India often talks about Chinese trying to encircle India by opening a strategic bases in Burma and Pakistan. What do you think about that? Second is that, could India choose options to be part of CPEC without compromising on the sovereignty issue and leaving political resolution for future, but having profit partnership in present? Could it bring China as an important partner? Third question, till now, India has been silent on the whole issue around the origin of COVID-19 and the blame game of US and China. But now the WHO chair is with India, and what should be India's response to that? Fourth question, looking at the unpredictability of President Trump's, can India rely on the assurance to back India in case of conflict with China? And the last question is, what are the implications on China after Ladakh became Union territory? We'll come to the second, one more round, sir, after this.
Okay. Right. Sorry, I was just making some notes so I don't forget any of the questions. Encirclement, yes, with attempts to obtain basing rights in Myanmar, in Burma, with the development of the port in Gwadar, with the acquisition of Hambantota, thanks to the folly of the Sri Lankans who allowed themselves to walk into a debt trap with the PRC, with India's own errors, self-goals in Nepal, which enabled the PRC to develop a much better foothold in Nepal, especially after the 2015 blockade, which I alluded to earlier. All of this is contributing, whether China plans it or not that way, to a sense of encirclement of India. If I was an Indian defense planner, I would see this as encirclement because of the growth of Chinese capabilities. Many China scholars who are so beholden to the PRC say, oh no, these are merely economic investments. They have nothing to do with strategy. I think this is palpable nonsense. Let me be absolutely clear about this. Once you have those capabilities, your intentions can change on a dime. And Chinese intentions towards India have never, since the formation of the PRC in 1949, have never been particularly benign. The nonsense about Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai notwithstanding. That was rank folly on the part of India. And India, as Nehru himself said, we've been living in a make-believe world of our own making. It was one of the most honest statements he ever made in Parliament. The PRC's views towards India have never been benign, contrary to the folly of certain people in New Delhi who continue to believe in the possibilities of a meaningful partnership with the PRC. It's not going to happen. The evidence is abundantly clear, and one has to be deaf, dumb, and blind not to see that. Which leads me then to the question about CPEC. I think India was wise to stay out of CPEC because this is a Chinese-dominated enterprise, and India would be very much a junior partner in this enterprise. And I think India is wise to be cautious and to carefully see how this entire process and institution evolves before jumping into the fray and committing itself to this organization. India, I think, was quite wise in terms of not putting its eggs in this particular basket. On the blame game, India shouldn't join the blame game, but what India should look for is what Australia is doing, asking for an independent, transparent, honest evaluation about how COVID-19 developed. Not to rely on Chinese reassurances, not to rely on what the WHO says, which is fairly beholden to China because of China's very substantial contributions to the WHO, but India should insist upon an autonomous, independent, honest, clear investigation of the origins of COVID-19. There is nothing unreasonable to demand this because this is a pandemic that has affected all of us across the world, has cost the lives of hundreds of thousands of people across the world, has destabilized global economies, and we have every right to know if this did originate in a lab and was accidentally released from the Wuhan Virology Institute, or if it was simply an animal to human transfer. And even if it was an animal to human transfer, then what steps might we take globally to ensure that yet another pandemic does not afflict us? So there is little or no question that India should forthrightly insist on a transparent process and an independent process that enables us to trace the origins of this absolutely vicious pathogen that has left all of us, trapped in fear for our lives. Fourth, on the unpredictability of Trump. Yes, absolutely. He is utterly unpredictable. He makes extraordinarily foolish statements like last week, saying that he was ready to mediate the Sino-Indian border dispute. I doubt that he even knows where the Sino-Indian border is located, let alone his ability to mediate. And as if the Chinese, who are now in a particularly hostile mood towards the United States, would see the US as an honest broker. And Trump's record of mediation has been disastrous. How well have his negotiations worked out with North Korea? It's an abject disaster. His plan for resolving the Palestinian-Israeli dispute was dead on arrival. It was laughable. And this is a man who's going to negotiate the Sino-Indian border dispute. The man's folly and arrogance is simply breathtaking. Having said that, fortunately, there are people in the US Department of Defense, in the US Department of State, who are, for the most part, formulating day-to-day policy towards India and South Asia, given the ignorance and stupidity of the American president and his unpredictability and his cluelessness. So fortunately, there are a handful of adults in the room who will try and ensure some element of policy continuity, and hopefully, in the event of another crisis, might be able to influence Trump. And bear in mind, November is coming. Trump may not be here forever, and I personally certainly hope not, and will do everything to see that he returns to New York or Florida or wherever else he'd like to move to in the event of his loss, which I am dearly hoping for in November. So the unpredictability of Trump is a concern, but bear in mind that there are more sensible, predictable, thoughtful people in the permanent bureaucracies that matter, and within especially the US military. Fifth and finally, Ladakh as Union territory. Yes, that probably irritated the Chinese a bit, but I don't think that fundamentally changed anything. It probably only added one more layer of Chinese Chinese hostility towards India, but I don't think it fundamentally contributed to a growth in hostility.
We have a few more questions.
Yeah.
How do you read about early harvest? How do you read about early harvest quoted by former PRC ambassador Lau Chao-hai with reference to Sikkim in India? How do you see nationalism in India-China relations with regard to border conflict? In March 2020, Pakistan requested China as the monthly head of United Nations Security Council to initiate a discussion on Kashmir in the Security Council, something that it has done repeatedly, especially after the abrogation of Article 370 and 35A. How much can Pakistan influence China, and what will be its impact on India-China relations? Third, what strategies should India make about Tibet in context of current Indo-Sino tensions? Fourth, what is the reason behind the tension between India and China? Does China want to warn India not to approach America? Last, what shall be India's damage control strategy in Nepal as a lot is already lost in context of Chinese influence in Nepal? We'll come for the last round of questions after this.
The first question was not terribly clear. I'm not sure really, I've not heard this term early harvest before. Could you possibly clarify that question?
I think I've not heard about it, but according to the question, it says that the former Chinese ambassador to India, he said somewhere about the current tension with reference to Sikkim in India, that it's an early harvest. I don't know what it means. How do you see nationalism in India-China relations with regard to border conflict? Maybe you can ignore it and I can ask, we can get it clarified from the author.
Okay. In terms of Sikkim, of course, the Chinese were unhappy when Sikkim was incorporated into India as another state of India. That was clearly something that made the PRC unhappy, but they didn't do much about it. Nationalism, of course, plays a role, and it has become much more pronounced in recent years in India under the Modi government. There has been a rise of nationalism, and some foolish statements have been made by a number of television commentators who do not recognize India's military weakness vis-a-vis the PRC. And that certainly exists. But let's be quite clear. Nationalism is much more easily manipulable in the PRC, where there is no free press, where Global Times can invent things, where the Beijing Review can write anything it pleases, where there is significant control over the flow of information. So the asymmetry between India and China is significant. Yes, there are a number of foolish armchair strategists in New Delhi, whose names I will not mention, who are known to this audience, who make any number of irresponsible statements and fuel a degree of nationalism. But that's nothing in comparison to the completely controlled media, except for small elements of social media in the PRC, where the CCP can manipulate nationalism as it feels necessary. There are multiple voices in India, despite the folly of some of these short-sighted, myopic armchair strategists who sit in New Delhi in comfortable, air-conditioned offices and make ridiculous pronouncements. But that pales into comparison, given the ability of the CCP to manipulate Chinese nationalism and talk about China's greatness and its willingness to stand up to India and the United States and Japan and nurse grievances which go back to the 19th century and selectively read Chinese history. So the comparison in terms of hostile nationalism between China and India is separated by an ocean, frankly. Second, yes, Pakistan will never lose an opportunity to try and persuade the PRC to raise the Kashmir issue in the Security Council. Fortunately, the other great powers, or at least members of the Security Council, Britain is hardly a great power today. It's a declining power. But because of the 1945 arrangements, 46 arrangements, it still has a seat in the United Nations Security Council. Britain, the United States, France have no appetite whatsoever to, or even Russia have no appetite to bring up the Kashmir issue. So yes, as the old Arab expression goes, the dogs bark, but the caravan passes. Pakistan is like this barking dog. but very little will happen as a consequence, even if the PRC does bring up the issue in the UNSC, nothing will really happen. It's a dead horse that it will keep flogging. In terms of Tibet, India could make a statement about Tibet, about how its autonomy, which China promised, has been steadily compromised. It could raise the issue of human rights in Tibet. It could allow the Dalai Lama greater leeway in terms of activities. There are a number of things it can do to remind the Chinese that it too possesses a useful card. But it should not exploit the Tibetan issue. It should remain really committed to the rights of the Tibetans, who, in my view, have been treated brutally, cruelly, and abysmally by the PRC. And the world, for the most part, has ignored the blatant violations of human rights in Tibet. On the Sino-Indian question, I'm unsure what to say, because I thought my entire talk was devoted to explaining the origins of the recent tensions in Sino-Indian relations. So I'm unsure that I can add anything more to what I have said. I am sorry if I wasn't adequately clear on any particular point, but my entire talk was devoted to explaining the current difficulties and tensions in Sino-Indian relations. The fifth question, Nepal. There's a great deal that India could do. It should meaningfully engage with Nepal on the recent Kalapani dispute, instead of simply saying, restating its own position. It should it should provide greater access to India in terms of Nepalese goods coming into India. It should never again engage in the blockade that it took part in 2015. It should assuage Nepal's fears of any kind of interference in its domestic politics. There are a range of steps that India could take to reassure Nepal and to reduce Chinese Chinese influence in Nepal and avoid any form of high-handed behavior. Amongst other things, it could increase its aid to Nepal. It could enhance developmental activities in Nepal. There is a range of possibilities of improving Indo-Nepalese relations, which unfortunately have suffered in recent years.
The next question is, how will increasing Russia-China relation affect the Indo-Russia relations? Second, what should be India's strategy in the context of transforming a structure of international system where the United States surrounded with complex internal and external realities, and Europe is reluctant to go against China, and China is more powerful in many dimensions to India? Third question is on Nepal. The road has been built and inaugurated at Mansarovar by China and India. The road in Nepali land is in Lipule and Lipadhara. What do you think about it? Are India and China plan to do it? Only the intention of it? Actually, it's not clear. Actually, what happened recently, India has inaugurated one road in the disputed territory of Nepal and India. So the question is like, and the same road was also mentioned when Narendra Modi visited China in the joint statement that India and China will use it as a pass. So the question is like, do you think that India and China unitedly try to use Nepalese soil or disputed territory? A fourth question is, considering present dispute in Nepal-India relations, will there be implication on the nature of Nepal-India relations, especially on the open border? I think it's not relevant. What kind of role does Bhutan play in the context of Sino-Indian relations? And the last question is it time that India admits that its capabilities cannot match China and thus reform its strategic response to China accordingly?
Right. Uh, uh, in light of improved Russia-Chinese relations, where does India stand? Um, uh, uh, in the short term, this is worrisome. In the long term, it really doesn't matter for a couple of different reasons. First of all, India's dependence on Russia will increasingly decrease in the years ahead as it moves away from weapons purchases from Russia, the acquisition of the S-400 missile system notwithstanding. India is increasingly diversifying its acquisitions of weaponry. India no longer counts on a Russian veto in the United Nations Security Council. Indo-Russian trade is not dramatically expanding. There's a bit of Cold War nostalgia amongst some people in New Delhi and elsewhere in India on the Indo-Russian relationship, but the Indo-Russian relationship cannot be resurrected. Russia really is a declining power. It's primarily selling natural resources and relies on its nuclear arsenal and its, of course, position on the UNSC to still maintain great power ambitions. But it is not, it's a declining power for the most part, and there are differences between Russia and China, and consequently, over the longer haul, the possibility of a Russia-Chinese condominium against India is highly unlikely. So in the immediate term, yes, it matters, but not over the long haul, especially given Russia's almost secular decline, which Putin has not been able to arrest despite his great power ambitions. And it's unlikely that Russia will suddenly resurrect itself as a great power anytime over the next couple of decades. Yes, at the present time, Europe is preoccupied with any number of domestic problems, as is the US. In the US, some of these wounds are self-inflicted. They have much to do with an extraordinarily foolish, inept, and clueless president. But this is not a permanent condition by any means. I have lived in the United States for over 40 years, and I have witnessed periods of crises in the United States. First, the oil crisis of the 1970s, then later on in the 1980s, fears about Japanese domination of trade, then fears of Chinese domination, then fears of US's economic collapse after the 2008 financial crisis. The US has proven to be remarkably resilient, and I maintain long-term faith in the United States despite the extraordinary damage that Trump has done to the country. I think the US will recover both from the damage that Trump has done and from the COVID-19 pandemic. Europe will also, to varying degrees, bounce back, and it is increasingly having doubts about its extraordinary dependence and integration with China. I think the Europeans will be forced to reconsider some of their policies, some of which are already becoming evident, and the Chinese are behaving in an extremely hostile fashion as the Europeans slowly but surely stand up to China individually, starting from Sweden to Germany, and hopefully even the British, who have become acutely dependent on the Chinese for trade and investment, are beginning to make noises. Sir Richard Dearlove, the former head of MI5, recently in a public statement said that he believed that the COVID-19 virus originated in the lab in Wuhan. So there are signs of assertiveness coming from Europe. So India should bide its time and not simply cave in to China because of the uncertainties and the difficulties that Europe and the United States face at the moment, and India should take a longer term view of the matter. I am simply not knowledgeable about the Mansarovar road between India and China through disputed territory, so I can't really comment on this. I apologize for my inability to comment on this. This is something I need to look into, but I'm reluctant to comment on something I don't know very much about. Or know nothing about. So I'm grateful for this question, but I must confess to my ignorance about the matter. The fourth question on Bhutan. Yes, India, I thought, demonstrated a degree of resolve during the Doklam crisis, and I hope it will continue to do so in the future of another Sino-Bhutanese confrontation, that India will not shy away from defending Bhutan's strategic and national interests, because it's in India's interests to ensure that Bhutan remains an autonomous entity and is not subject to Chinese threats and intimidation. On India's strategic response, yes, I have already said this in my earlier remarks, that given India's lack of capabilities along the land border, what it ought to do is to develop its capabilities at sea, to develop greater assertiveness at sea, to increasingly build links with Japan, with Vietnam, with Australia, with Indonesia, and especially the United States, to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific, to ensure freedom of navigation, and to remind the PRC that it has vulnerabilities in the Straits of Malacca.
Thank you, sir. Let me end with one last question.
Okay.
How would you comment on recent national security law of Hong Kong? How will it impact China's relations, or you can say Hong Kong relations with India, UK, and United States?
Well, the US has already made it clear that if this law is actually implemented, then Hong Kong's special status in terms of trade will be adversely affected. I have not seen a more vigorous response from the Europeans, except expressions of dismay and unhappiness. For India, it matters very little, except that this is a significant loss of personal freedoms and civil liberties, and India should generally be concerned about this, not just at home, but abroad.
Thank you, sir. We learned a lot from today's lecture and all these questions and answers. Thank you for your time.